Good evening. Wow, it's a wonderful experience to be in a room with so many people who love the outdoors. My name is Lisa Yao. This is Sarah Rennick, and this is Avilash Kumar. And we're leaders from outdoors clubs at the Harvard Kennedy School, Business School, and MIT, respectively. And we're really excited to talk with you guys about conservation tonight. So thank you so much for coming out on a Monday night. Before we begin, we wanted to tell the story about how this event came to be. Last fall, Adam Bidwell, who's in the back from Arc'teryx, and I, we sat down at the Harvard Kennedy School and we were brainstorming ideas about how Arc'teryx, the Kennedy School, and the academic outdoor community in general could partner together to take action on conserving the places that we and our community love. Adam mentioned that Mike Morin, who is our regional rep from the Access Fund, and several of the speakers here tonight would be in Washington this month for the annual Climb the Hill event. And at Climb the Hill, they advocated for the importance of public lands and outdoor recreation, which is awesome. And so we thought, wouldn't it be great for the greater Boston community to hear about what's happening on the Hill? We thought that we might attract an audience of 100 people, maybe 200 if we were lucky. But here we are as a room of almost 400 people who love the earth and love the outdoors and conservation. And probably a couple hundred more who are tuning in on live stream right now. And we're also with some of the best environmental minds in the country on a Monday night, which is a really wonderful thing. So thank you again. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Hi, everyone. We are so excited tonight to hear from these amazing panelists about how outdoor recreation can help protect our most precious and fragile spaces. None of this would have been possible without the incredible support of our sponsors. Firstly, thank you to Arc'teryx for the incredible financial and logistical support you've provided for this event. Secondly, without the Access Fund, it would not have been possible to bring together such an incredibly distinguished and diverse panel that we have today. And finally, thank you to New Belgium Brewing for sponsoring our after party tonight at Catalyst. If you haven't registered yet, please do. There'll be a slide up about it later today. Finally, a huge thanks to the MIT Outing Club, which I think the contingent is generally over there. This event would not have been possible without them. When the number of attendees spiked far beyond what we had imagined, we were in need of a large space fast, and My Talk stepped up immediately to make this event possible. So I'd like to just give a quick thanks or clap to My Talk for supporting us today. I'm now going to hand it off to Avi for some information about a donation matching.
We also have some exciting news to think about as you listen to these incredible speakers talk about the future of conservation. Arc'teryx is announcing that starting today and through this upcoming Sunday, it will be matching donations through this link to the Restore Rumney campaign, a joint project between Access Fund and the Rumney Climbers Association. If there ever was a time to give, it would be now.
Hand off the mic to the moderator for the evening, Rand Wentworth. Professor Wentworth teaches environmental leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. He was the president of the Land Trust Alliance for 14 years and successfully negotiated with Congress to pass several major conservation bills in Washington. He is also the founding director of the Atlanta office of the Trust for Public Land. Professor Wentworth encourages all students here tonight to take his spring semester course on leadership and environmental conflict, which he describes as a boot camp on how to heal the earth. And with that, please let's give a warm welcome to Professor Rand Wentworth.
Great job. Thank you, Sarah. When I was really little, my father would take me every Sunday after church to a wild place called the Great Swamp, just 25 miles due west of the Empire State Building. And that's where I fell in love. Just in the late winter, skunk cabbages would generate through chemical miracles warmth that would warm the snow above their head so they would be the first thing poking out in the early spring. It was a place where I saw a skunk and a raccoon and a great blue heron for the first time. It was a place where I realized that I was at home. After years of falling in love with this place, the front page of the newspaper, when I was just in elementary school, said, New York Port Authority to build a massive jet port on the Great Swamp. Now, to a fourth grader, the idea of having asphalt and tarmac and motels and gas stations where I had fallen in love was just beyond what I could imagine. What was miraculous to me, though, was that somebody who had more power and more insight than I did, a local woman named Helen Finsky, went door to door and she said, we can't let them do this. And she started raising some money and she said, let's buy the 5,000 acres that is what they want to be a new jet port. And I'll be damned, but they did it. They bought the land. And then the New York Port Authority said, thank you very much for assembling this land. We have power of eminent domain. We'll take that land from you. But she didn't stop at that. She got on the train, went down to Washington, D.C., met with her representative, who introduced her to the Secretary of the Interior. And she said, I will donate this land to you if you'll make it a national wildlife refuge. And the only thing the New York Port Authority cannot condemn is the federal government. So she outsmarted the most powerful people in the New York metropolitan area. What we're here to do tonight is to talk about how we can outsmart those who would clear-cut, mine, drill the most beautiful places on earth. I want to start by acknowledging that the land that we stand on, sit on tonight, is the land that was the original home of the Massachusetts tribe. This is where they gathered clam and they fished and they hunted for venison. And I think it's important that we recognize that we are privileged by their ethic of protecting land as part of the one vast network of life. The Native peoples understood in their DNA their intimate relationship with nature. There's this ancient knowledge. They would know the tracks of the animals, what poet Gary Snyder calls barefoot equals, sleeping on the same ground. They would see the moon and the stars arc across the night. They would know the smell of the air after a rainstorm. This healing power of the land is still here for us, for any of us who've been outdoors, who have climbed, who've hiked, who love to see the water, the sky, the rain, the rock. What we know now from science is that time in nature actually makes us smarter, makes us wiser. It calms us down, lowers blood pressure, increases concentration, has a positive effect on obesity and diabetes, this colossal pandemic of inactivity that has taken over our country and our world. Well, with all the importance of land to our lives and to our health, what a tragedy it is now to know that the administration has weakened 85 regulations, environmental regulations, and that the Grand Staircase Escalante, the great lands in southern Utah, were cut in half, that Bears Ears has been cut by 85%, and drilling and mining is taking over our world. We cannot sit still and watch this happen. We have seen the reversal of the Clean Power Plan, the rollback of emissions, and now climate change threatening everything that we love. But the most extraordinary headline in the past year was not all of this bad news, but the emerging head of a piece of good news, like that skunk cabbage I told you about coming out of the frozen ice. And that was that somehow business interests, environmental groups, the recreation industry, people who fish and hunt, Republicans and Democrats came together and said, we are going to make the Land and Water Conservation Fund permanent and we're going to fully fund it. That passed through the Republican leadership in the Senate and the Democratic leadership in the House, and it was signed by the president. So there's an extraordinary story in there that I don't want you to forget as you listen to everything tonight, that when people come together, and we're going to be looking at tonight the emerging and growing power of the outdoor industry and the emerging and growing power of young people who stand up and say no. The great yes in that no is that we have proven that we can be successful, that by working together, business, nonprofits, young people calling for change, we can reverse this nightmare that we have been walking through. So I want to just shout out to Arc'teryx, to Patagonia, to REI, to Black Diamond, to the Outdoor Industry Association, businesses that are working to conserve the places that we love. And now it's my great honor to introduce Tommy Caldwell. I'm guessing that if I ask for a show of hands, everyone knows Tommy Caldwell. But what I want to say about Tommy is that here's a guy who's been through adversity and suffering. Every one of us has had a time of adversity and suffering. But if you're a professional climber and your index finger is cut off, that's the end of your career. If you're climbing in Kyrgyzstan and you're taken hostage by rebels and about killed, that's about the end of your career. And somehow this man has gone into hell and has found something deep in him that has driven him to climb. Driven him to climb extraordinary ascents, 12 routes up El Capitan. Probably most in this room have seen the movie The Dawn Wall and have seen what tenacity it takes to do the impossible. So please join me in welcoming Tommy Caldwell.
Thank you, Rand. I feel pretty unqualified to be here today with these panelists, being as how I barely graduated high school. But it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Access Fund for roping me into this. My path as a conservationist is really just starting. I feel like I'm just dipping my toe into it. And so I was a little bit surprised when I was invited here tonight, but I figured that they were like, well, if we bring Tommy, more people will come and watch, so I guess that's why I'm here. And they're like, just like show some slides. But what I decided to do was do a presentation basically on my path to conservation, because although it is just starting, I have gotten a little bit of the ways there, and so yeah, that's what it's about. For those of you who don't know who I am, professional rock climber. I've spent my whole life in national parks, on public land. My dad, who was a mountain guide, brainwashed me super early by way of making me think that like 20 hours hiking through the mountains was a good idea of what I should do for my 7th birthday. So this is me on top of Lungs Peak for my 7th birthday. And because of him, I became addicted to the outdoors and to climbing pretty quickly. And climbing's a very intimate relationship with nature. So I think I had a great love of it and therefore great care for it from a pretty early age. But my path after that, after that initial introduction, was really largely one of kind of selfish pursuit. I decided to try and test my own limits as a climber. I went and sport climbed for a bunch of years, did climbing competitions, then got addicted to El Capitan, and spent about 15 years of my life just kind of going and trying to do harder and harder routes on El Capitan. And like I said, it was really an effort to just try and test my own limits. And I've gone back and forth at times of kind of feeling bad about that. Like, why would I spend 15, 20 years of my life doing something that just served myself? But I've started to come around on that in recent years, because I feel like if you're going to give to people, you need to spend a lot of time building yourself. And so, my university was Yosemite University, and I spent 20 years there, so more than most of you guys. So, like I said, I felt like I was a pretty selfish climber for a lot of years. But a few years ago, when I decided to take on the Dawn Wall as a project, it helped me to understand the power of collaboration, and it really was because. Oh, wait, sorry, wrong slide. Okay, before that, the first step out of that world of seeing kind of beyond my own goals was really having having kids. My daughter, Ingrid, right there. I do love her more than my rope. And my son. And I think that was the first time when I started to think not only about my own climbing, but like, what is the impact that I'm gonna have on the world? What is the future going to look like, not only in my own lifetime, but their lifetime? And I think that was one of the things that got me more excited about, trying to protect the planet, or protect humanity is probably more accurate. And then I've kind of started to figure out how to do that, because I think I spent all these times like trying to test myself. But this guy right here, Kevin Jorgensen, who's in the forefront of this photo, was my partner for the Dawn Wall. And this climb, which it seems like a lot of you probably know something about, became an incredibly collaborative thing. It was a big climbing project that I had that was honestly far, far beyond what I ever could have done. Like, it was just something that was way bigger and harder than me. It took me 7 years, and it never would have happened without Kevin, without having this incredible collaboration, this spirit, this brotherhood that came about through the Dawn Wall. And so because of that climb, I started to think, like, if I really want to do cool stuff, I need more people involved. I need the most awesome people involved. And so after the Dawn Wall, I started climbing with this guy right here, Alex Honnold. I like this photo because it's the only photo that I look like more of a badass than Alex Honnold. Looks like I'm guiding him right there. Which I kind of was, actually. But climbing with Alex has been pretty good, because he is like very inspiring to me, and he's been exactly the right person. He's one of these people that I can get together with and feel like, along with Kevin, but even more Alex, feel like his level is so much higher than mine that I just by osmosis or whatever become a better climber. And so I've gone all over the world, done a bunch of cool climbs with him. This was us on the Fitz Traverse in southern Argentina, this really cool 5-day link up of all these mountains that we did. I'm going to show you one really a time lapse for a climb that we did a few years ago when we broke the speed record on the nose of El Cap. And I decided to show this because it really is sort of the culmination of working with somebody and really getting that relationship to jive. Because climbing El Capitan in under 2 hours, which is what we ultimately did, took both of us spending 10 or 15 years, me 20 years on the wall, learning about it, and then coming together with somebody and doing something that was just like way more crazy than I ever thought I could have done myself. And I just thought I'd show it because I knew there was going to be a lot of climbers in the room that wanted to see it. One thing that was really interesting about this climb is, in some ways, it was pretty risky, which made me feel like a bad father in a lot of ways. But on the other hand, I would get to the top by like 8:30 in the morning, which meant that I could go home and spend the rest of the day with my family. So I felt like those things kind of balanced each other out. Another reason I decided to show this to you is because climbing, while being selfish, has given me quite a platform. A lot of people want to hear what I have to say now, and so I get to choose what to talk about and get to choose the difference that I want to make in this world. But I think for a long time I just thought, of my life in terms of what can I do for climbers. But I had an experience a few years ago that started to shift my view, thanks to Erik Murdock here in the Access Fund. I got invited to DC for my first time. Politics is like the last thing in the world I ever wanted to be a part of. But I figured it would be a life experience to go to DC and be a part of this thing. So when they invited me, I said yes, and I went around. And the first year, we went around and we took meetings all over the hill, this giant group of people. And we had like 50 meetings, and we'd sit down with staffers and a few senators, and we'd talk about different bills. We were talking about the Land and Water Conservation Fund on this trip, I think, was a big initiative. And I'd kind of sit there and not say too much, shake hands with senators. A few of them, surprisingly, especially the staffers and Senator Bennett from Colorado, were kind of like fans in a way. They'd like seen the movies, and so that's why we got the meetings. I was like, okay, that's how this works. We just show up so that people come to the meetings, much like tonight. And that makes a difference. And so I didn't see it as being related to climbing at all. It was like I had my climbing, I had lobbying, or just one day of lobbying, and they're completely unrelated. But then I kept getting invited back because it seemed like like the model kind of worked. And so I started to kind of get involved in politics a little bit, like kind of get excited about it, and I started to wonder how I could truly make a difference. Because I was showing up in these meetings, I knew nothing about the bills, but I was there, and I started to think, how can I really be effective in this world? And what am I really good at? And what I decided I was really good at is adventuring. I'm not really good at talking to politicians, but I am good at adventuring, and I'm good at telling stories. So those things started to knit themselves together in my mind, and I decided that the thing that I could probably be, I always think of my friend Jim Collins, and he always challenges me to think of that thing that you can be the best in the world at. He's that secret, and that thing can be really niche. Like for 20 years of my life, my thing that I could be the best in the world at was big wall free climbing on one rock on El Capitan. That's like about as niche as you can get. And so I started to think about conservation. I was like, okay, maybe I can be the guy that goes on awesome adventures and brings back stories of climate change in places that are falling apart. And so about 6 months ago, I heard about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and how it got open to drilling in the military funding bill. The Trump administration snuck a provision in there that opened it to drilling, this fight that's been going on for 40 years. I'd been on a climbing trip to a national park called Gates of the Arctic, right next to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so I was like, okay, what I should do is I should go up there, I should do an awesome adventure, the coolest adventure I can think of, and see the place and bring back stories of how special it is. So I started to think about that, and I was like, well, really, if you're going to conserve an area, you need to know the people that it means the most to. Like, I'm a climber from Colorado. There's people there that actually rely on this land. So the first thing we did is we went to this thing called the Indigenous Climate Summit in Fort Yukon, a community of mostly Gwich'in. And we had this 3-day summit where we hung out with them, we danced with them, we heard stories of climate change. And I went up to this meeting thinking that they were going to be split on whether drilling was a good idea in the refuge or not, because a lot of their money comes from the oil industry. But it turns out, at least in Fort Yukon, they were unanimously opposed, and it's because that money they get from the oil industry is really a very small amount of money, especially when a gallon of milk costs $14, which it does up there. And so they mostly live off subsistence hunting and the caribou herd, and they're worried that it's going to affect the caribou herd. So we went and we had 3 days of listening to them and some climate scientists, and it was a full immersion in their culture, which was a wonderful experience in so many ways and made me care so much about those people. Then we went into the refuge itself and just came up with the coolest adventure we could think of. I really like pain, so I sort of formatted this trip to take us as many miles as possible every day, like 18 hours of walking under the 24-hour-a-day sunlight in the middle of summer in the Arctic refuge, and just had this crazy experience. And this place, we suffered. We certainly suffered. We got through big storms in the middle of summer. We got dropped in this one valley. We hiked up over we climbed the second highest mountain in the Brooks Range, which was Mount Hubli. We slid down the fastest receding glacier in the world. This is the Hubli Glacier. And then we went out onto the 1002 area, and this is the area that's going to be open to drilling. And there's this big misconception. I think a lot of the people that want to open it up say that the 1002 area is total wasteland. It's useful for nothing at all. That doesn't look like wasteland to me. It's probably in the back, it's hard to see this, but in the foreground is, probably about 600 caribou. There's a herd of over 10,000 caribou that live here, and it's the most intact ecosystem, wildlife ecosystem in North America. It redefined wilderness. I've been all over the world. I've been in a lot of cool places, and this place absolutely redefined wilderness for me, partially because the wildlife just looks so vibrant and so healthy. There's a wolf that we encountered one day. We were eating lunch down in this hole, and this wolf popped its head over the top of the hole, and my reaction was to kind of be like, oh my God. I grabbed the bear spray. I'm like, is this thing gonna attack us? But it had no aggression at all. I don't think it had ever seen a human. It was just purely curious. And it occurred to me in that moment that the real beauty of this place is that it is an example of what this planet looks like without mass industrialization. And we need that reminder. So that's one side of it. The other side is that we did come across pretty distinct examples of climate change even affecting this place that is really, really far away from the actual industrialization. The glacier was one of them, the fastest receding glacier in the world. We walked for about half a day across the place where the glacier used to be, which just leaves, rubble and silt and, a lot of carnage. This is a picture of the permafrost melting. Around the rivers, the permafrost was melting and the land was collapsing. I think a quarter of a planet or something like that is covered in peat moss and or permafrost, and it captures a ton of carbon, and it's going away. It's starting to melt. And so the Arctic, by the way, most people in here probably know this, but it's already past that 3 degrees Celsius threshold of global warming. It's warming faster than the rest of the world. Global warming affects the Arctic. It affects high altitude places where I live, and it affects underprivileged people more than anything else. And so these are distinct stories I can come back and I can talk about. So we did this amazing trip through the Arctic, and then we came back, and just in the last couple of weeks, I went back to DC with stories of this trip, and started talking with a little bit more expertise about what we should be doing, why we should protect these places. And once again, as a climber, we're getting meetings with Chuck Schumer. There's Alex Honnold, Sasha DeJulian, and myself talking to Chuck Schumer. I got to testify in front of a Senate special committee on climate change. And I would say that at one point, I despised the idea of getting involved in politics, but when you show up and you feel like you can make a difference, all of a sudden, it feels right and it feels noble, and it made me realize how we can all make a difference if we just start getting involved. It's like climbing a mountain. You don't really need to know how to do it. You just need to decide you want to do it, start at the base, and have an adventure along the way. So that's my presentation. Thank you guys so much. Well.
All right. Tommy, don't go away. All right.
Yeah.
So tell me, when really bad stuff happens, which has happened a few times in your life, so what happens inside you and where does it go, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think I've trained adversity through my whole life, I think it started as when I was a really young kid, my dad bringing me up on Longs Peak and we're running from lightning storms. He was the kind of guy that when things got scary, he would be brought to life. That's what brought out the best in you. When things got serious, when they got dangerous, you could look in his eyes and you could see this excitement. And that, I didn't realize for the longest time how important of a mentality that is. And so that's kind of what happens. Although, there's things in my life that are absolutely devastating. They take me a really long time to get through. And when I'm going through them, they're tough. But I always have this knowledge that that at some level, once I'm strong enough and those hard situations strengthen you, I will be brought to life and it will bring out the best in me. And so if I don't unintentionally encounter hardship now, I seek it out through things like the Dawn Wall or going to the Arctic Refuge, and I love it. I'm addicted to adversity at this point. Yeah.
Well, that's good news because Congress is going to throw a lot of that at you. So tell us a little bit about what's the bridge in the skill set for hanging off the Dawn Wall for 19 days and getting this intensity that you've got now on climate change and conservation. How do the skill sets relate?
I mean, I think I've had so many things in my life where I've had these like ideas that seem so incredibly far-fetched, that seem so impossible, but there was like this tiny little glimmer of hope that it could actually turn into something, that I could achieve or get something that I wanted. And I think climate change feels that way to me. You have to have, at times, an almost unrealistic optimism that spurs you forward, but it turns out maybe what seems unrealistic a lot of the time does become possible if you really focus in very intensely.
Yeah. You've talked some about your father. Tell me about, what did you learn from your father?
I mean, I learned about like that story I just told. I learned a lot of, I think we all learn at some point that we're our father's and our mother's children, and there's good things and bad things to that. One of the things people ask me all the time is like, are you going to raise your children the same way that your father raised you? And I'm like, yeah, but he almost killed me on several occasions, so I think I'm going to dial it back just a little bit. But I think I'm actually probably more like the things that I really appreciate in terms of the way that they raised me. My father exposed me to this love of adventure, but my mom really exposed me to like being sympathetic and caring a lot. My dad was almost too macho for that, and I think that's probably what served me the best in this world. But a little bit of the balance.
Okay, so now you're a father of two, a son and a daughter. Mm-hmm. How does having children change how you go about your work?
I mean, I think like I said at the beginning of my presentation, it extends your vision long beyond your own lifetime. And I think I only thought of my time on this earth before I had children. And now I think about theirs. But, once you think about theirs, you're like, well, I might as well think about the next generation as well. And so I think that's the big difference between people who really want to fight for climate change and those that don't. The people who are thinking very short term are the ones that don't. And the ones that are thinking long term are the ones that do.
That's it. It's long-term thinking.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the Dawn Wall. You've done pitch 15 and have gone higher. Kevin's trying hard, but it's not working. You could have just gone up, right? But you turned around and you hung there with him as a friend, but also like a coach, and you gave him the confidence that he could do this. So I look at that and I think rock climbers are, they're kind of crazy and they're going up just for themselves. But there's something that you showed in that moment that, call it love, call it friendship, but you were there for somebody else. And I think about the work that we have to do to reverse climate change, to protect this earth, is going to be about relationships. We're going to have to be able to hang in there with people. So I just wanted you to reflect a little on that moment with Kevin and the decision to come back down.
Yeah, I mean, I think I talked a lot about being a selfish climber, but I am my mom's son, which I appreciate, and so I think there's also this ethos in climbing. It's a little bit like war in that way, like you go to battle and you don't leave a comrade in the field. So I was thinking about that a bit in this moment, but ultimately it came down to the reason I climb is because I like what it exposes about life to me. Like it's this crazy adventure. And the goals that we make are really just a mechanism to live this incredible life of adventure. And so that's what won out. Like when Kevin started failing, I was like, wow, this is upping the adventure quotient a lot. Like, this is kind of an incredible experience. And if this makes it so we have to come back next year or the year after, or even if we don't do it, this is like a life experience I don't want to pass up.
Yeah.
And so I guess we can probably think of climate change in that way too. Even if we don't achieve, even if, our kids all perish, we might as well have a good adventure trying to keep that from happening.
All right. Yeah, party till it's over. So in the Don Wall, we saw you as a scrawny little kid and your father feeling like he has to toughen you up. And you've gone from that to testifying before the United States Congress. And I'm just wondering, how did that feel?
I think whenever you get into something new, it's going to feel a little bit scary and awkward at first, but I don't know, I can only think one way, so I think of, training my speaking ability or my mind or my muscles all the same way. I just expose myself to like minorly traumatizing experiences at like a slightly increased level until I get used to them. And so going to climb the hill and then going back and lobbying for the LWCF and then eventually working my way to doing a Senate subcommittee hearing was the next step. And so ultimately, it felt real good. Yeah.
So some people in the audience may not know what climb the hill means. You want to explain that?
Yeah, Climb the Hill is a event put on by the Access Fund and the American Alpine Club that brings climbers to Washington, D.C., and all sorts of mostly outdoor groups do this. They go to D.C. with a whole bunch of people. They schedule meetings all over the place, and we go and talk about the issues that we're interested in and try and move that needle a little bit. I hope I did that justice.
And the amazing thing is, people run for Congress, not everyone, but most of them, actually want to hear your story, right? And it's fun.
Yeah, I would say not everybody's story is fun.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it works, because we come there and we talk about climbing and we talk about the beauty of the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, and it's a lot different than just sitting down and talking about, the numbers and the votes and the bills, and it's, it brings an element of like adventure to the world of politics in a way that's different than what they're used to.
So there may be people in the audience tonight who love climbing, love being outdoors, but not quite sure what they could do. What advice would you give them?
You mean in terms of like conservation issues?
Yeah.
I think the place to start is to use the tools that the community around us has created, and the outdoor community has actually got a lot of these days through organizations like POW and the Access Fund and Patagonia. One of the easiest ways I know is Patagonia has this tool called ActionWorks, where you can go on their website and find all the environmental nonprofits that are in your area, and you can volunteer and you can learn about them and you can give them money, and that is great in itself. But what it really does is it gets you in that community of people who are like-minded and thinking about how to make the world a better place, and that community is really what makes you the most effective. It's like getting Alex Honnold and Kevin Jorgensen on your side, and then you can then have all of this knowledge and motivation and this fun atmosphere that then allows you to be way more effective.
Yeah. And we saw with the passage of the Land and Water Conservation Fund last year, the power of those kind of groups coming together. And for those of you who don't know LWCF, it is authorized 25 years ago by the U.S. Congress to fund $900 million every year for the protection, acquisition of places for people to connect with nature. So it's a great thing. Tommy, I think at this point, you've got a few friends who'd like to join the party, so I'm going to call the panelists forward. And as they're coming forward, I want to just alert you that you're going to be in the conversation in just a moment. We're going to ask the panelists to reflect a little bit on what Tommy's been talking about. But you'll see here a link for typing in any questions you might have for Tommy or any of the panelists. We'll go live on this in, about 10 minutes or so. So think about what questions you'd like. We'll pause for a minute now so you can either scan this or enter this on your smartphone. Panelists, will you come on down? And Tommy, why don't you take a seat as well? We're going to have you in the conversation. All right, everybody set with this? Couple more? Okay. All good. Okay, so we have some amazing panelists with us tonight, and I'm going to introduce them one at a time and then ask them to just give you 2 or 3 minutes of what they're up to, and then we'll get into a larger conversation. And we'll start with Bethany Lebowitz. She's a climber. That's the most important thing, I guess, to say. And she strives to foster a community where women are encouraged to be in the lead. She's the CEO of Brown Girls Climb and hopes that climbing helps to elevate women of color and underrepresented voices in the climbing community. She's doing beautiful work. And Bethany, could you talk a little bit about what you're up to?
It's heavy. So Brown Girls Climb, recently this year we started a membership model. So we really work as a co-op to build community within and between women of color, but also the other underrepresented identities. So we're advocating for inclusive spaces, including the outdoors. We were at Climb the Hill, and it was great to be part of that conversation and get more in depth with conservation. A lot of what we do is mentorship, but also amplifying women of color within the industry, within the outdoor industry, so that we can be represented at a larger level.
Terrific. And Erik Murdock, we'll bounce around here a little bit, but Erik is the policy director for the Access Fund, which you've heard about in Tommy's comments. It's a national climbing advocacy nonprofit, and his work focuses on public lands legislation, wilderness policy, federal policy, recreation policy, but the whole focus is on connecting public lands with access points, especially for climbers, but they've got a big portfolio on climate change and everything. So, Erik?
Yeah, how many folks know about the Access Fund in here?
All right.
Okay. That's good. I mean, besides Tommy, I think I've got the best job in the room. So I work as the policy director for the Access Fund, and what the Access Fund does, as you all know, is we protect climbing access and also conserve the climbing environment. And the climbing environment can be your little backyard boulder, or it can be an entire landscape like Bears Ears National Monument. And we're focused on making sure these places are conserved for a lot of different reasons. The Access Fund is an accredited land trust, so we buy climbing areas and we give them back to the public. We give them back to allow for public access. And we've got this massive grassroots system, and some of you are probably part of it. And I think one of the greatest things about this event is that it benefits the local climbing affiliate in this part of the world. And we've got about 120 of these climbing affiliates all over the country who are doing really good work. So the policy program specifically works with municipalities at the city level and all the way up to the national level, like at Climb the Hill. So that's basically what the Access Fund is up to. Oh, and then we also fix up climbing areas, and that's the last thing. We have teams of trail builders and stonemasons who go out and fix up climbing areas so they're resilient and sustainable for future generations.
Thank you, Erik. And Estee Rivera Murdock is the executive director of the Rocky Mountain Conservancy. They publish publications, they offer seminars, they support research, and they provide actual philanthropic support for the Rocky Mountain National Park, as well as other public lands in both Wyoming and Colorado. Estee has worked for the National Park Service for 10 years prior to this, and in her thesis did research on who's not showing up at national parks, and especially looking at Hispanic populations. Steve?
Well, like Erik, I would usually ask, who's a member of the Rocky Mountain Conservancy? But I'm in the wrong state, so I don't want to disappoint myself here. But we've been a public lands partner since 1931. So we have the oldest, what we call Field Institute in the National Park System. And we also have a significant Youth Conservation Corps program, as well as other ways that we provide stewardship. We're not a land trust, but we do a huge amount of land protection through acquisition and giving it back to the park. That's always our end goal. We are based in Estes Park, Colorado, but really we represent a lot of the public lands throughout the Rocky Mountain West region, ranging from southern Colorado up to southern Wyoming.
And finally, Katie Wallace, who I think does have the best job in this room, is the Director of Social Environmental Impact at New Belgium Brewery. She's been there for 15 years. You can work ethically and drink to responsibly. That's right. She develops organizational understanding of environmental and social issues impacted by and how environment and climate change affect risk to business and to brewing. So, Katie?
Great. Great to be with you guys tonight and excited to have a beer with you afterwards. How many people have had a Fat Tire, Voodoo Ranger, like beer in general? Awesome. Cool. So I don't know if you know much about our story at New Belgium, but 29 years ago, we started in Kim and Jeff's basement in Fort Collins, Colorado. Jeff was one of those people ripping the fenders off of cruiser bikes and throwing them down mountains. And he also had a passion for home brewing. And Kim was a social worker. And so neither of them had any business experience in their family. But they decided they really wanted to bring this beer to life in the United States. And as they started going through the obligatory process of running a business, people were telling them that they had to do things that were less environmentally friendly so they could continue to make money and stay in business. And people were telling them that they had to give their coworkers less profit sharing and reduce ownership so they could stay in business. And I think that they kind of gave the middle finger to that. And they said, no, like business has a responsibility to be a force for good in our communities and our environment. And we depend heavily on our environment to, on the rivers to make our beer and on the communities to support us and also to contribute to helping our business run. So I run our social and environmental impact program there. We look at coworkers, the environment, and our community. We're a certified B Corp, and through that we try to attack issues around climate change, land and water protection, and social equity. We have a philanthropy program where we donate $1 per barrel of beer sold to environmental and social equity causes. We also have a policy arm, so that was kind of an interesting thing to get involved with. Like a lot of times if we are active in that space, people will just say like, stay out of politics, just keep making beer. And we're like, man, politics is in our beer. So we need these rivers and we need this land and we need equity within our communities, and that's what beer is about, is bringing people together. And so we've been very active in that space in addition to the traditional sustainability, operational, and supply chain work. So I think it's really cool to be here with this group today because we all represent a different organism in the ecosystem of advocacy, and we each have a really unique role to play here. And some of the best work and the fun work that I'm working on these days involves these collaborations with various groups and see how we can all work together and play a unique role.
Thanks, Katie. Since we just heard from Tommy about Climb the Hill and showing up in Congress and not being nervous, I wondered if the panelists maybe tell us a little, what were you calling Congress to do when you were at the Climb the Hill recently? What policies might actually move the needle in expanding public access, diverse populations, and making public lands more resilient to climate change? So what were you asking them to do? Who's first?
I'll start down here. So at Climb the Hill this year, we advocated on a handful of buckets. One of them was just public lands and how are our land agencies funded, how are they staffed? You know, there's a little bit of a leadership vacuum. There's a lot of acting people, and right now there's not much getting done. There's some funding issues, so we were advocating for bills that helped out with that, like the Restore Our Parks bill and LWCF funding. You know, right now, yeah, it's incredible that LWCF passed the program, but the money's not there, and we're really pushing to try to get that thing funded to that level that Rand was talking about. We're also talking about balanced energy development. So right now, a lot of things are happening. The administration has cut away, for example, the comment period on oil and gas leasing. So, you know, 2 years ago, when an oil and gas lease was up for auction, we'd have, 30 days or sometimes more to send in comments. Now it's 10 days. There used to have to be analyses to look at these things, and now there aren't those. So we're sort of fighting for a more a fairer process for that. We're also looking at a couple other things, but I'll let other people talk, and maybe I'll hand it down to Bethany to talk about how we're looking at equity.
Yeah, so this was my thank you, my second year at Climb the Hill, and as I said, I'm a little bit greener, similar to Tommy, so it was an exciting time for me because I got to have a little bit more time to dig into the legislation that was being proposed, or that was had already been proposed. So one of them that I was pretty excited about was the recreation, not red tape. And I won't go into detail, but there's a lot of points in this legislation that increases access to everyone. But with regard to what I'm doing, it's important for underrepresented groups, communities of color. And in this, a few points that I was really excited about was that it allows better access and education around outdoor opportunities for veterans, and also includes a piece about career opportunities after they've served. And so that was really exciting. Oftentimes when we think about underrepresented communities or under-resourced communities, we kind of always think about communities of color, certain certain communities that bring up a lot, but we do forget about veterans, and so it was really great to see that incorporated. Additionally, there is a SOAR Act, which talks about permitting access, and so if you've ever been guided in the outdoors, that whole process for the guide that is taking you out to hike or climb or fish or whatever is a really lengthy and a really burdensome process. And for the future Brown Girls Climb, we're looking at possibly extending our services to include guiding as a career option for women that we're connecting with. And so being able to reduce the barriers of like going through all this paperwork is really exciting to us, because there's enough barriers already out there just to get a job, much less like guide or own our own guiding service. So we were really excited to advocate for that.
Estee?
Well, I did not go to Climb the Hill, so in full disclosure, I'm not a rock climber. I'm sorry. But I do have the unique advantage of having an office that is in Rocky Mountain National Park, which is the third most visited national park in the country. So members of Congress come to us. That's a very exciting field trip to them. So it's been really great to have members during the government shutdown, which was a very difficult time for the gateway communities around Rocky Mountain National Park. Within the first day, we had our members of Congress, Cory Gardner, Michael Bennett, Joe Neguse, calling and asking, what is going on? What are the impacts that you're seeing? And some of them actually, so, bipartisan support saying there were all sorts of reasons for the government shutdown, but unilaterally, they all felt that the parks, should not have been a pawn in this. So it was great to have that bipartisan conversation. And right now, we're doing a lot of work around the Restore Our Parks Act. So Rocky Mountain National Park alone has an $84 million maintenance backlog. So we're a very successful philanthropic organization. In a very good year, we give $2 million back to Rocky Mountain National Park. So if you think about it in the long term, we can fundraise a certain extent, but we also need to step into the advocacy field and start advocating for these bigger changes for these maintenance backlog bills. So the thing that has the biggest impact is taking a member out of Congress and showing them decaying park employee housing or a trail that's this deep in mud, So for us, oftentimes going to DC is great, but it's better if we can get them on site in some of those public lands.
Anybody else on this question?
I guess I could weigh in for a second. I mean, I've primarily focused on public lands issues because a couple of reasons. Public lands are great for climbing. But the main thing is that when we protect big swaths of land, it takes it generally off the table for the extraction industries, which is ultimately very, very good for climate change.
So let's talk about diversity, right? So first, we acknowledge that the public lands we enjoy were also the original homes of indigenous people and native tribes. And now they're natural areas that people of color often don't feel welcome or they're not encouraged. And I wonder if you would reflect a little on what some of the obstacles are for nonprofit conservation groups to diversify and for federal land agencies to make people feel more welcome. I'm thinking, Estee, this is...
I was going to say, I got a lot of looks at me. I just spoke, so I didn't want to hijack that. So putting my student hat back on, my graduate work was at the University of Arizona. No Wildcats in the room. Looking at non-visitors to national parks. So looking at members of the Hispanic community in Tucson, that's primarily Mexican-American audiences, that did not go to Saguaro National Park, and asking the questions why. And some of it, as simple as it seems, it went back to things like the promotional materials that the park was putting out, where people would say, there's all these beautiful landscapes, and then a picture of like a tortoise walking across, but we've never seen pictures. So it hadn't, nobody's invited us, and it hadn't necessarily occurred to us that those are for us. Also, the park rangers are dressed almost identically to the Border Patrol agents, which, also not the most welcoming atmosphere on different levels. So a lot of it came back to the issue of nobody's invited us and some of the cultural norms around that, and then discrimination. And whether, it's real or it's perceived discrimination, the impact is exactly the same. It's that diverse communities don't visit those places. So thinking, how do you invite them in different ways and make them feel very explicitly welcome to those places? And I think the Park Service has come a long way, even in recent years, with some of the work they did around the Centennial and the Find Your Park or Encuentra tu Parque campaign. And now it's really fun being on the other side of the NGO side of things, where we have even more flexibility outside of some of that bureaucracy to do things like we just funded the National Park Service participation in the Gay Pride Parade in Denver, something that maybe isn't the highest priority for the federal government, but that we can help facilitate those sorts of interactions between all sorts of different diverse stakeholder communities.
Yeah, and the Access Fund really sees itself as sort of an ally organization. So we, over the last several years, have been partnering with organizations like Brown Girls Climb and Brothers of Climbing, Flash Foxy, and a bunch of other groups that are really helping us.
Outdoor Afro?
Outdoor Afro, and several others. Latino Outdoors, exactly. So we've really been sort of partnering with these groups to understand this space. We've also hired a native lands coordinator to help us negotiate with Native communities and to work on reservations. And recently, about a year ago, we hired a DEI fellow to help work through our internal issues with diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as our external messaging with regard to DEI. And we've done things like coming up with land acknowledgement policy and really baseline sort of policies that help us navigate this space. For me, the most powerful experience I've had working for the Access Fund was working with the Intertribal Coalition on the Bears Ears National Monument designation. And that was a great example of how to get that designation passed, to get President Obama to write this proclamation and get that thing going, we had to bring together the conservation community, the Native American community, the recreation community, local stakeholders, all together in order to come up with a really good plan. And that was a really powerful experience. So when this administration reduced Bears Ears National Monument, we took it we took upon ourselves the responsibility of making sure that's not going to stick. And that's why we sued the Trump administration to reinstate Bears Ears National Monument. And that's brought our community even closer together with the Native American community. So this is sort of the beginning of a really incredible relationship.
Yeah, I would just add, like, when we talk about diversifying the outdoors, a lot of times we'll phrase it in a way that, you know, how do we connect people of color or certain communities to the outdoors? And for us and kind of what we do in the other groups that Erik mentioned, like, it's really about reconnecting to the outdoors because our cultures are rooted in the land. And so that's part of what we're trying to push with other organizations is, like, how do we tell those stories that aren't being told? How do we unpack the really complex history of the park system and kind of acknowledge it and move on and hopefully come up with solutions that will incorporate the many diverse voices and experiences in our country. So I think storytelling is a big part of it.
Okay. Katie, before you go, Bethany, just tell a little about the power of the photos, the images.
Yeah, I mean, so Brown Girls Climb started as an Instagram for me, really, just to find other people of color, other women of color to connect with in the DC area. And it resonated, to my surprise, with women all over the country and then some in other countries. For me, there's like a very distinct moment where I saw this woman, I think her handle is Lala Adventures, but she's a Colombian climber and she's topping out on this 12A and she's like, just like so psyched. It was her first 12 that she climbed. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I started as a boulderer because I started climbing alone because no one else did that where I was and in my family. But I saw her and I was like, man, maybe I should do sport climbing. I was talking to Tommy and now I have a sport project. Finally, it took me like 8 years to come around to ropes because it's scary. But it's like, it's powerful to see that. And like, you know, it's not just about climbing for me. And I think for anyone who does this work within communities of color, it's about being able to use that experience and like have it as a template for folks to use in other parts of their life. And I was able to use it to like go into my undergraduate education, not having anybody to like, you know, guide me as much. And it was really great. So, because I got to develop that resiliency and those tools to deal with failure or deal with disappointment through climbing. And I think it's not going to work for everyone, but it can work for certain people. So why not share it?
Thank you. Thank you. Katie.
As a business, I think we ask ourselves, like, what is our role? And in some places, we will have a role to play based on what we do and what's relevant to the business, and other places we won't. And in this case, I look at, like, what are our tools? We have our philanthropy program, so I'm lucky enough to have a large budget each year to play with and support good causes. And instead of us going out there and doing the work, supporting organizations like Access Fund and maybe one day, pretty soon, Brown Girls Climb and others. And so, and making sure that, that we're giving money to the nonprofits that are working to create these opportunities. So the majority of our youth environmental education grants have all gone to underserved communities, to like paying that money to get like kids on a bus that wouldn't normally get out to a national park and getting them outside, having a new experience, learning what the darkness is like. There have been projects we've heard of where like kids didn't bring the flashlights, which was like #1 on their list, and for an outdoor adventure. And you know, they were asked, why did nobody bring flashlights? And they're like, because we didn't know it got this dark. You know, and like helping to create these experiences, and we partner up with the organizations that are already doing that work. We specialize in beer, and these orgs specialize in getting more people outside. The other thing we have is our platform, so using our brand platform to show more images of people being outside. So our Fat Tire handle has a lot of outdoorsy pictures on there, and we had a campaign this summer called Finding Common Ground, and we had athletes that represented various sexual orientation or color or heritage, and making sure that we're just making sure we're using our brand platform to help convey these messages that are being worked on by other groups as well.
So just to wrap it up, we all want the outdoor world to look like the rest of America, right? With all of its wonderful diversity. Obviously, as the United States Congress moves with more diverse representatives, it means that we're right there with them as that power rises. But the real reason to do it is it's just the right thing to do. If access to nature has all of the health benefits that science now tells us, it should not just be affluent white people that get access to that. There's a moral imperative, and a banner that I've been marching behind now for 30 years is that every child in America should grow up within a 10-minute walk of a park or a trail or a natural area, something that can just be part of their daily lives. And I think that's something that we're all aligned with now. Let's move on to just a question for those of you who work in and around the outdoor industry. What's happening there? What's rising and what's falling? What do the prospects look like? And Tommy, maybe I can turn to you because you now work for Patagonia. How is the outdoor industry? Where is the outdoor industry going on these kind of issues, and are there threats or opportunities in the outdoor industry?
I think mostly opportunity. I think the outdoor industry is doing a pretty good job of leading in certain ways. I recently took on a role with Patagonia. I'm a GSA, a global sports activist for Patagonia now. And so what that means is I activate climbers primarily towards environmental issues. And through that, I've learned a lot about what Patagonia is doing. Everybody knows about their campaigns to give a lot of money to environmental nonprofits. They started the B Corp thing. They started 1% for the planet. They also, they gave all their tax break money, $10 million from the Trump administration tax cuts to environmental nonprofits. They did the Black Friday thing. They do tons of stuff like that. And that's all kind of like the markety, forward-facing stuff, which I find kind of inspiring. The thing that I find really inspiring that they're doing, which I don't think many other brands are doing, is the supply chain stuff. They're going and they're analyzing their entire environmental impact and spending a lot of money and a lot of time figuring out exactly how that company is harming the earth. And they're making systemic changes to do better there. Like one great example is that they, through their company-wide audit, they realized that something like 70% of the carbon that Patagonia was creating to go in the air was at the mill level, the actual mills that make the fabrics. And they realized that they had like a couple of mills that were primarily producing all that fabric, I think in China. And so what they did is they went and they negotiated with those mills to get their power from solar instead of from coal-fired power plants, which is where they were getting. And just by looking into it, didn't even cost them that much money, they were able to reduce their overall carbon footprint by like 30% or something. And so they're just by looking into it, it's like and by the way, those mills don't only make fabric for Patagonia, they make it for all the outdoor brands. So they change the industry in that way. So a lot of companies are doing the things that are making environmentalism cool, and that's great because it's creating a culture shift. But I want to see more companies actually, walking the walk more effectively, and I'm quite inspired by Patagonia and the ways that they're doing that.
I think it's like a twofold process for us as businesses where we have to be walking the talk. And it's also, for many years, Patagonia included and several other companies, we've been working on understanding our footprint and doing everything we can within this current economic regulatory structure to improve it, make changes, create innovations, and lower our impact with the existing structure that exists. But after working on that for so long, there's really only so much we can do until we run up against some enormous systemic barriers around transportation and big agricultural systems and various foreign manufacturing dynamics and whatnot. And so at that point, I think that that's where a lot of us started getting into advocacy. Like, let's change the regulations then. Like, we have corn subsidies still, we have oil subsidies still. Like, that really worked 100 years ago to solve some major issues across the country, but it's not working for what we need to do to take care of ourselves today. And so kind of like looking at these various things, like the window of time in which we have to contest oil and gas leases, and really looking at these systemic issues, a lot of us are going towards the policy side to kind of talk the talk and shout it out, because as businesses, we have a unique voice. You can have activists in there and environmentalists in there, but if you have a business coming in and then saying like, and actually we have our jobs depending on this, our markets are depending on this, and we're one more layer to that encouragement towards making the right decision at the policy level. And then you hit this other brick wall, which is like special interests control policy. And so that's, you can really, in the policy advocacy space, only get so far at that point in time until you really have to start looking at the whole economic structure overall. And I think that that's something where, Erik was mentioning today, a report that came out a few days ago saying that the entire outdoor industry generates over $700 billion a year. And that's enormous. That's larger than most of the special interests that are speaking up and controlling government. And so why is it then that these concentrated points of power are influencing our strategy, even though they're outnumbered by the outdoor industry, for example? And so I think that that's really exciting right now, to see this ecosystem of voices coming together within the outdoor industry. Of course, I think that not as many of them are walking the walk like Patagonia is, and that has to be pushed at the same time, but we can also get there much faster if we have some of those policy advancements that can support the entire industry to go there. And so I think as far as like what's happening in the outdoor industry right now, people coming together in an enormously powerful way to be allies that show up with different looks, different arguments, different faces, but all pointing towards the same end.
And I would add to that in the last couple of years, we've seen some incredible strides in the outdoor industry. Things like the Outdoor Retailer Show, moving from Utah to Colorado simply because the outdoor industry was not going to stand for the politics of Utah on public lands. That's huge. The entire outdoor retailer moved because of that. The outdoor industry also pools the resources in certain ways. So for example, there's an organization called the Conservation Alliance, which pools money from all these different companies. And then they take that money and they distribute it to organizations like the Access Fund. With the help of the Conservation Alliance grant, it helps to send us to DC to further our litigation. And they funded this specifically, further our litigation on bears' ears. And that's really important for a lot of reasons. It's not just bears' ears. Yeah, we really need to protect that landscape. It's just like Anwar. It's this incredible landscape that just needs to be protected. But also we're protecting, and the Conservation Alliance and all the organizations that fund it know this, are protecting the Antiquities Act, because that affects things like the Martin Luther King Monument and the Harriet Tubman Monument and Devil's Tower, all of these different national monuments. So I think that the outdoor industry is moving in the right direction, but there's certainly some places to grow.
I just wanted to add a bit about the consumer point of view. So Brown Girls Climb is made up of members, and so what we do is partner with companies to provide discounts on gear, products, or training opportunities. And one thing that we do is we go in and ask them about their justice, equity, diversity, inclusion initiatives, along with their sustainability initiatives. And so when thinking about how to influence the industry, I think it's really, really powerful if we take a moment and think about, what am I wearing, who made it, who physically made it, were they protected, and what's the lifespan of this product, and then get those answers from the companies that you support, and know where your dollars are being spent. And if not, raise those questions up to these companies. And that's when putting that pressure on companies allows for more and more of this collaboration and us to finally find solutions for this. Sorry.
Estee?
I think one area too where the industry as a whole has evolved is in terms of youth engagement and youth employment. So I think, 10, 15 years ago, everyone was having this conversation about let's, as NGOs or federal agencies, prepare everyone to grow up and be smoke jumpers or park rangers or whatever the federal careers were. And we at the Rocky Mountain Conservancy, we have a next gen fund and a conservation course, so we've invested a lot into youth training. But reframing that, there's a real bottleneck in federal careers. There's not that many positions, and there's all of these youth coming out of these training programs. And so the entrance into those training programs has gotten a lot more equitable. So you're seeing slowly things like unpaid internships go away and really be frowned upon, whether it's at the big greens or with federal agencies, of saying if you want to level the playing field, you've got to pay a reasonable wage, even for interns or fellows or entry-level positions. But also thinking about when people come out of those programs, the Youth Conservation Corps, where do they go? Not necessarily a park ranger, but they might, go on to be a beer brewer or a Tommy Caldwell or whatever other sort of career that they choose, school teacher, nurse, and thinking about how have we knit them into that ecosystem of conservation so they have these transformative experiences and these immersive work experiences, and then they most likely spin out to other things. But how do we, train them so that in whatever career they go into, that they can continue to be advocates for public spaces and public lands? And I think we're slowly getting better. The end goal is to not, get them into a government polyester uniform, but to just get them wherever they need to go on their path, but understanding how that transformative experience impacted them and how they can pass that on to future generations also.
That's great. Anybody else? We good? So I want to give equal time to Arc'teryx. They're sponsoring the party we're having later. So we heard about what Patagonia is doing, but get with the Arc'teryx people who don't happen to be on the panel tonight. I'm sure they're doing wonderful things too. Reminder once again that you're asking questions now, and I just got the first one. Let's see. From Ken from Alaska. How do you balance the need for increased conservation with the challenge of providing access to wild places? So Ken, if I've got this right, you're making the distinction between protecting land and having access to that land. So, where people go, sometimes they're trampling things, but without people, we don't have political support. Who'd like to pick that one up first?
Wait, can you repeat the question?
All right, so the question is, how do you balance the need for increased conservation, buying more land, protecting more land, with the need to provide access to those wild places?
Yeah, I mean, we don't think that having more people enter the wild spaces is a bad thing. There's a lot of space, and I think that what a lot of people don't see is that most of the people who go into these wild spaces go only to a couple of these places and are really not causing a lot of damage in its entirety, but they're focusing the damage. So what we're doing is we are trying to make these places where people go more resilient, more sustainable. So that's why the Access Fund is sort of focused on building sustainable trails and erosion control and that kind of thing to accommodate the number of people. So inviting more people into our community, becoming a more diverse and accepting outdoor industry, that's a good thing.
I would also say, and we had the opportunity to talk to one of the Harvard Kennedy School classes earlier today, and we talked a bit about this notion of, public lands are being loved to death. I really feel like that's, a little bit of a concern that's been fueled by a lot of the media narratives around it. When you think about Yellowstone National Park, for example, the roads there are about 1% of the park, and most people don't go more than half a mile off the road. So it's a little bit of a misnomer. What does get impacted is that individual's experience in the park. And so it can be really damaging if someone comes to a public land and it's very crowded and they have this frustrating experience. For some people, that's actually a great experience. They want to go there and see other people and be social. For some people, it can be a very negative experience. So thinking about the visitor experience getting crowded out. But in very few instances is it actually doing a significant amount of ecological damage on the ground itself in most of these places.
Yeah, and I think sometimes increased numbers actually help conservation. Like during the last government shutdown, in the national parks that have a lot of climbing, the climbers stepped up to the plate and started being the de facto caretakers. And so climbers are good stewards. People who really have this intimate relationship with the land care for it the most. And so, yeah, I think more climbing is just going to protect these places.
All right, next question. What room do for-profit corporations have in monetizing the outdoors? What does responsible involvement look like? Is it possible to both preserve and profit? Good question.
That's that half of the table.
Can you say that again? Can you repeat the question?
So we have public lands and we have wild lands, privately owned. But the question is, to what extent do for-profit organizations have a role in monetizing the outdoors? And I think I should make a distinction between whether those are public lands with the government allowing drilling and mining, or are they private lands, under private ownership. Got a thought?
Yeah, I think, so one of the things that we're working with a couple of partners on right now are doing case studies on the economic value of the outdoors, or various activities on public lands. So right now, American taxpayers get very little payback for the extraction that happens on public lands. But that's our asset as citizens of this country. And so we're working on funding some research projects that show on a piece of land that people are wanting to do more extraction on, what would be the economic value of preserving that for trails or for hunting. Hunting licenses actually fund quite a bit of the preservation of public lands. And so we're looking at these various economic benefits, not only with having those sports present there and creating more of an attraction in that area, but just like the halo effect that has on the local economies and creating more jobs for people who work in restaurants or hotels or any of the other support for those outdoor destinations. And so I would say that's one thing that we, as American taxpayers, should be thinking about. Like, are we getting the best payback on these public assets, and especially when you add in the cost of climate change and the impacts of extraction. And then otherwise, I think like any low impact revenue that you can bring off of land has to be a good thing, because it protects the reason for the land being preserved in the first place. And so I can speak to, for us, for example, like beer we're members of the Conservation Alliance. We are in this outdoor community, but we're not like making backpacks. But like, how many of you have had a beer after an outdoor adventure or packed a can in your backpack or something and packed it out? So we are a part of this, and like this is a big part of our brand and our platform, and so I think that by featuring that in our advertising, that does well for our brands, and that's a great way to make money featuring the outdoors, but not necessarily having to extract from them.
I think the distinction here is between sustainable ecotourism, which connects people to land and builds a constituency, versus extractive permanent damage to the land, mining. We're now governed by a mining act that was first written back in the 80s?
1872.
Thank you, 1872. You've done your homework. And oftentimes those mining rights are purchased by some other country, right? So this is ridiculous that we're giving our natural heritage for pennies per acre. Somebody else on this question? Tom?
Yeah, I'll touch on that quickly. I think corporations and industry kind of hold a lot of power in this country to do sort of whatever they want with. And, getting involved in elections and getting people out to a vote is a huge thing that they can do to make it all work. This one isn't really public lands related, but another thing that Patagonia does that I think is really exciting is looking into taking things that are usually very bad for the earth and flipping that and making them good for the earth. And so like regenerative agriculture is a huge thing. They sell a lot of cotton. And, through regenerative agriculture, there's actually processes that can allow you to make that process of growing carbon really, really remove a lot of carbon from the air. And so they're investing hugely in figuring out and furthering technologies like that.
Yeah. Great. Hey, next question from you guys is, can you talk a little bit about the role that you're seeing voting playing in the conservation movement? So conservation movement from just maybe acquiring land or taking care of trails, but actually having an advocacy edge on voting. And then relatedly, what role does protest and activism like Friday's climate march all over the world play? This is a question from Gabby and many others. Thoughts on voting?
Well, voting is the entire thing. When we do work at the state level or at the federal level, everything hinges on who we're working with. We need to vote people into power who believe in the same values as us. Public lands are essential to this whole movement. Sort of to tie it back to the last question, if we vote for certain people, we're voting for more development on these places and not balancing the different values of our public lands, right? We've got recreation values, we've got conservation values, we've got traditional values, and then we also have these values in oil and gas. And all of these things have to be balanced. Right now, the values of the development are being held up on a pedestal. It's the priority, the energy dominance mandate, and everything else is sort of diminished. So we need to vote people in who are interested in bringing up the other values of our public lands. And that's why I think it's important. Arc'teryx is supporting this entire thing because they care about our public lands. Because people who are out, because it's the right thing to do, and also because people who are out and experiencing the public lands are supporting the outdoor industry and bolstering this whole thing. So, if we can get people out to vote so that our legislators are actually doing things on behalf of everyone that benefit everyone, then we'll be in a much better place.
Yeah, I can answer a little bit to this. So recently, Brown Girls Climb signed on to this piece of legislation called Transit to Trails, and basically what it does is it provides federally matched funds to states to provide public transportation to urban and rural areas, to public parks and public lands. And I was really excited to be able to be in a position where I could sign Brown Girls Climb, a collective, onto this bill onto this letter for support. That's thinking back on my role within the conservation movement. It's not far back, it's a couple of years, 1 year. But how I see myself in this conversation has been, it's continuing to grow, because when I think of conservation, I think of not my family, I think of white culture, I think of men, I think of a narrative that I wasn't a part of or am not a part of. But then when I look back at my upbringing and my culture, what I see is conservation practices. That has been a part of my story and part of who I am for a long time. And so it's important for me to show up in this conversation. Otherwise, it will be that same narrative. And so what I try to do and how I try to lead and how we try to lead as a collective is recognize that your voice and your vote does matter, because otherwise we will end up in the same position for another 20 years, another 50 years, and we'll get to that point and be like, oh, we should have asked those people, or I should have spoke up. And so even if some of this doesn't resonate with you or your culture, going back and thinking about how did I connect with the land, that it can be very impactful to determine how these pieces of legislation are written and formed. And so, yeah, that's my take.
I think there's like no better illustration of why voting matters than to see what's happened in our current administration and the number of protections that have been removed. Because it doesn't matter how much we as citizens care or businesses are trying to change things, we can't possibly do it without the people who are making those decisions supporting that direction. And so I think, and the second question was climate strike, right, and how that valuable that is.
Yeah.
And so I think things like climate strike can be really incredible for like the youth getting out there and saying this matters to us. We're all going to leave school for a day. We have spent all of this energy to coordinate and organize because this is our future and it means this much to us. Like that sends a powerful message that puts pressure on decision makers that they have to explain why they would go against that. I also thought it was pretty powerful that Amazon coworkers are also striking because they don't think that their employer is doing enough as far as climate goes. And so, but the strike isn't for everybody. I think that, if you're doing environmental work in your job every day, like taking a day off work for that, maybe, what's how will that message reach an ultimate decision maker? I think that sometimes things like the We Are Still In movement was more beneficial for a lot of the businesses because as Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords, a huge portion of the economy said, no, we're still in, we're gonna still push for this. And so we just have to figure out like where to invest our limited time and energy and money towards actually making sure that a message gets home to somebody. And I think in some cases you're looking at trying to change a decision maker's mind and help them realize that this does matter to them or their constituents. But sometimes they know that it does and they're going to make this decision anyway because of other special interests. And so we want to make sure that as we're putting on these extra, you have voices from the youth, you have voices from workers, you have voices from companies, you have voices from athletes and nonprofits and other communities and educators and whatnot. Everybody is having a different argument as to why action on this topic matters. It's really hard for a decision maker to dismiss all of those reasons. And so lifting the veil on and making sure that they are accountable, even if they don't want to be, is I think one of the big powerful results of having a strike, but also acting in the many different ways, whichever is appropriate to your group.
Excellent. Estee?
Yeah, and I would say, as a 501c3, we are, of course, nonpartisan, so we can't say vote for this individual or don't vote for this individual, but your comment about the special interests, I think there are many examples where we can show, hey, maybe our interests aren't so special. So a good example is a few years ago when the current administration proposed the fee increases. So at Rocky, it would have been a 280% fee increase. So we, of course, came out against that from an ethical standpoint of saying, hey, parks and public lands are not here, as a pay-to-play service, they're public lands. And many, many groups across the nation mobilized, many for very different reasons, but overwhelmingly the feedback that the Department of Interior got was that people didn't want to have these dramatic fee increases that were mandated from the top down, maybe a few dollars here or there at some parks, but not dramatic fee increases. And once it was apparent that it wasn't such a special interest viewpoint, that really people across the country from all sorts of different groups really didn't want to see those changes, the Department of Interior said, oh, nope, never mind, sorry. We will increase it, I think it was like $4 or something at some parks, it went up. So again, I think we often think of ourselves as this special interest group, but many constituents in this country get outdoors and have a passion that they just need to have that voice be heard louder.
We are almost out of time, but Tommy, you get a word on that, and then I'll put a last question.
Okay, I just have an idea. So, just getting a lot of people out to vote is going to be good for public lands. It's going to be, in our current climate, is going to be great for environmental issues. And so I think industry can play a huge role in that. I have an idea. When we were in Australia this summer, I learned that voting is obligatory there. You have to go and vote. And so what they do is they throw this giant party and have a weenie roast, and everybody goes and votes. And I think that's a great idea. I think climbing and outdoor industry, actually New Belgium would be amazing for this. You guys are incredible at throwing parties. Yeah, we need giant parties to get everybody to register to vote, and so it's really fun. And climate strikes actually are really good. One of the reasons, everybody goes out there because they care about what we're striking about, but also it's kind of a party. And so we just need to party more.
All right, all right. So before we wrap up, we're here for many reasons, but we're here for a call to action. You've heard from some extraordinary people who've committed their lives to doing this good work, but it's now your time to commit. 3 goals I'd like you to walk out thinking about: vote, join, and support. Vote, get out to vote. There's something called the Environmental Voters Project. Actually, they found that people who identify as environmentalists have been less likely to vote than the mainstream in the last election. So just getting out to vote is huge. Number 2, join. Join a nonprofit, join in this work to get to know your elected officials at the local level, the state level, and at the federal level. It's actually an amazing thing to show up at the U.S. Congress and find out that people are interested in what you have to say. Maybe not everybody, but the more voices, as we've heard, the more voices like water wearing down a stone, we will prevail in the long run. And finally, support. And support financially to the extent you can, support with your time as a volunteer, support with your letter writing. And tonight, we are going to give you an opportunity, as you saw on the first slide of the program, to actually do a match fund support campaign for one of the great climbing spots in the Northeast. Before we do that, though, please join me in thanking Tommy Caldwell and a terrific panel for their program tonight, right? Well done. Well done. I know they're all eager to talk with you. If your question was not raised, please talk to them after, and you're going to hear in a moment about where we're all going to migrate in just a couple minutes. Now I'd like to call up to the microphone Adam with Arc'teryx and Nick with New Belgium. And where are you guys? Fantastic.
Turn it over to Adam.
Cool. Thank you all so much for coming out. I know that in this discussion, it was great to hear from all of you. Thank you so much for coming. People don't really know about what Arc'teryx does or what we stand for. You know that we make gear, and we're a Canadian company, and that kind of permeates how we operate and how we carry ourselves. And there are probably some Canadians in the room. And if any of you in my talk know Chris, you know that a tenet of being Canadian is humility. But we also realize that we have a role in this community. And so Arc'teryx kind of sees it as our role to elevate and platform voices, to talk to more people, and to bring more people into our community. And that is why we sponsored this event, to stand up for these causes, because we really do feel that standing behind causes like this one and putting our money into this and putting our resources into this really is one of the best ways that we can invest back in our community. But another way, and I would invite all of you to apply, we do have a grant program coming up this spring. And in our last round of funding, we actually supported 3 different groups that each represent a different part of our value structure. One of them, of course, was Rumney, which is the matching grant, and please do consider giving. It's an incredible project and one that we absolutely love and are so appreciative for the Access Fund for running. But another one is Senders, a group. Yeah, they're amazing. Please look them up and join them at their climbing outings. And Senders stands for so much, and so much that we are proud to be working with. A group that wants to bring intersectional inclusivity to the outdoors that has been so lacking in this world for so long, and they are working and battling away at it. And I'm so excited to see way less people who look like me at the crag going forward. And Senders is playing a big role in that. And another part of that is a group that we're sponsoring called Elevate Youth. Some of you may know of the work they do, but they bring kids into the outdoors who may not have had those opportunities elsewhere. And yes, we're a Canadian company. We don't really know how to talk about this stuff. We would rather just put our money into it, support those groups, hold them up. And we're really proud to be doing that. And we appreciate you bearing with us as we find our voice in in talking about our own work, but in the meantime, we'd rather just put money into these groups who are doing such amazing work and have them do that work and platform them and elevate them and hold them up as examples to our community of how great you can be and how positive of an impact you can have. So thank you all so much for doing so much of that in your own work and in your own lives. It was a real treat to have you.
Thank you. Yeah.